Hello and good evening. I'm Lisa Oldham, Director of New Canaan Library, and it is with great pride that I welcome you all to the library for this evening's event. I'm really proud of our team here at the library and the hard work that goes on to put on the extraordinary range and number of programs. I learned this morning that we had 3,400 visitors to our programs alone in the last 2 months only. Crystal Chumney, who I think many of you know, who is the head of public services here at the library, and her team are incredibly focused on delivering the content that this community wants to learn. And across the library, including our family programming, which is organized by the families team, we offer over 80 programs each month. Tonight, I am so delighted to welcome you to the 22nd Attwood Lecture. After a 5-year hiatus, and thanks to a new Attwood Lecture Committee who have brought us Terry McDonell tonight. For those of you who don't know, the Attwood Lecture is named in honor of Mr. William Attwood, journalist, author, presidential speechwriter, and ambassador. The Attwood family and many of their friends worked with the library to put on the very first lecture back in 1991. Since then, there has been a long list of very distinguished journalists and authors who've graced our stage and shared their stories. This year, we are so thrilled to host Terry McDonell, editor, journalist, author, screenwriter. Terry has been editor for many of our most influential and well-read magazines and has recently written The Accidental Life and Editor's Notes on Writers and Writing. Without further ado, please welcome Terry McDonell.
Thank you very much. This is really an honor to be here. I'm aware of the Attwood Lecture. If you read the list of people who have delivered it, it is esteemed. Many of them are heroes of mine. Lewis Lapham, who gave the most recent one, is a big hero of mine, and I'm going to be interviewing him on stage in New York on Thursday night.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. Well, it's The Age of Folly is the book that he has put together, but that will be funny, as Lewis always is, and ironic. But anyway, the list is wonderful, and I knew most of them, so I'm very, very happy to be here. It speaks very highly of the community, I think, and there's nothing finer than that. A place where literature and journalism and writing are valued, at least for me. So I'm going to talk to you about being an editor, which I was for 40 years or so. The book, as it says in the subhead, is about writers and their work and working with them, and editing is really what I wanted to write about. And out of a kind of vanity, I think, I wanted to show myself as a writer. And I thought that probably the best way to do that would be to tell stories about the great writers that I had edited and try to be clear about what I had learned editing them. And not just about the writing, but about the writing life. Things like how Jim Salter never talked about being a fighter pilot, but loved to play touch football and kept meticulous records of meaningless pickup games, which made the games more fun, right? And how he and Peter Matheson would dive into the freezing surf in Sagaponack on November 1st every year, and then have chilled martinis on the beach with their wives afterwards. Part of the life. How Jim Harrison once told me, "You've lynched my baby," over some small matter of editing that I had committed, but how mostly we talked about food and how perhaps his most recent 12-course dinner with Mario Batali or whatever. Working with P.J. O'Rourke was like going over anthropology field notes, and how Richard Price, the novelist you know, I'm sure, would riff like Lenny Bruce when he was pitching movies, but it was all about honing his language for his novels. Tom McGuane called this having a long reach, which in his case meant being nominated for the National Book Award in fiction the same year he won team roping at the rodeo in Gardner, Montana. So, and there are interstitial chapters in the book that I wrote, chapters about getting under the hood, so to speak, as an editor, about making magazines and websites and swimsuit issues in my case, and how rewriting headlines on deadlines sometimes can, if you're good at it, can make you feel like one of those Looney Tune characters who produces a stick of dynamite lit from behind your back. And the book and my life have been about the media business and writing for money from what was really the crest of the new journalism in the 70s to the right now of digital innovation when the Media Lab at MIT, for example, is offering a class in journalism as an engineering project. I love this class. But those years, a timeline of those years is the arc of my career. But at the heart of the book and of that career and my life, the book also is all really about writers who became my friends and what that was like. And some of them are now dead, so it's about that too. I'm talking here about Matheson and Salter and Harrison and David Carr, but perhaps most especially about Hunter Thompson and George Plimpton, who shared an unlikely but indelible friendship when I was editing both of them. And I want to tell you about them. In the beginning, I would think that to edit them well, I had to be, or try to be, somehow as interesting to them as they were to me, as if. But that was how Hunter and George worked with the Hells Angels or the Detroit Lions or politicians or circus midgets or whomever they were writing about. George invited everyone he wrote about to his parties, and Hunter wrote careful, hilarious letters and schemed relentlessly to make himself interesting to his biggest subjects, like Muhammad Ali and Bill Clinton. It was all obvious. But I also found that just paying Hunter more made me more interesting to him. With George, I think it had more to do with being a good audience. One time I remember it was dusk, and we were walking on a ranch road in New Mexico. And according to George, we were birding. We were on the trail of the elusive burrowing owl that lives in prairie dog holes. But we were going about it in George's deeply civilized way that allowed you to bring your glass of wine or whatever you wanted along on your after-dinner expedition. In George's case, always a Dewar's with a little water. We'd seen no owls, but George had pointed out a bat or two when he'd set his drink on the ground suddenly, pulled his white T-shirt over his head and flung it in the air, you know. Tadarita Brasiliensis Mexicana, he explained, as the shirt peaked, perhaps 20 feet, and drew at least a half dozen bats, and they tracked it to the ground, like the tiny dive bombers they are, shrieking their shrill little bat shrieks. The second throw doubled the amount of bats, and on until I counted more than 150, and the light was almost gone. The trick, George explained, pulling his T-shirt back over his head, was to give the bats something that would come fluttering up on their sonar as food. Like a gargantuan moth, he said, taking a sip of his Dewar's. Now, it was predictable of George to pull something like bat expertise out of nowhere, because, of course, it really wasn't out of nowhere. When he was 14, George spent the summer hunting bats in California, donating the specimen skins to museums. It was the kind of summer job you had if you were George Plimpton. Now, listening to his stories about life as a teenage bat hunter was like hearing about the adventures of a young prince to me. But it wasn't his privilege that struck you, it was his curiosity. George's questions were like trampolines, a technology he admired, by the way, and they bounced you higher to the next question. This was particularly true when he was talking about writers and writing. Did you know that the great Camus played goal for the Oran Football Club? He asked me once when we were walking past an Algerian restaurant near his house on 72nd Street. I was unaware of this. Alas, George sighed, le connaisseur de bonne volonté was never moved to write about it. Imagine the existential goalkeeper. Alas. Alas, I said, and he gave me a look. But you see, to be or not to be was never the question for George. What to do next was his question. And although existential imaginings were at the heart of all of his magazines, he would develop ideas like, what would it be like to, and then find a way to put himself into the action. I asked if he had considered becoming a soccer goalie. He had, of course, but he had already written about guarding the hockey net for the Boston Bruins. So are you going to write that memoir, I asked, probably or obviously baiting him a little. I knew several publishers were interested, and one had offered close to $1 million. I don't want to write about my life, he said. So that's what you do now, I said. Well, shouldn't that be enough? But the memoir came up all the time. People were always asking him about it. When was he going to write it? They couldn't wait to read it. But just thinking about it darkened him. He said it smacked of vanity. And if he wound up having to do it for the money, so be it, but not yet. So, of course, the lure for publishers was that George knew everyone and had many stories. Any list would be incomplete. My favorites are Sinatra stories, Sinatra, neighbor, and late-night drinking cohort. Hugh Hefner, Hef, offered George the editorship of Playboy many, many, many times, and George had done time in the Grotto. Warren Beatty would call and shout, "Is this the man who has never had an olive?" George would say, "Warren, is that you?" And this was never explained. It had something, but, you know, perhaps in the memoir. It had something to do with Reds and Diane Keaton, I think. But no matter who you were, if you were with George or just at the same party, his manners pulled you in, making you feel comfortable and I think in on at least some of the secrets. And he had a way of bowing when he met you or said hello, just bowing his head a little bit, slightly, when he shook hands, which was subtle but very, very flattering. And this happened all the time. George met many, many people, except, of course, he couldn't remember names, especially men's names. But that didn't matter. "There's the great man," George would say, seeing someone he knew he had met approaching him at a party, and the unnamed guest would beam. Of course, "there's the great man" is also how George once greeted a kid delivering pizza to us. So we went out a lot to book parties and sports events at Madison Square Garden, where all the floor security guys knew him by name. "Hey, George." And mostly we went to dinner, and of course there were parties at the house too. And George, when we would go to dinner, he would order the same thing all the time, macaroni and cheese. That's all he wanted. And then parties at his house. This was the 80s and 90s now, and the celebrities weren't as bright as they had been in the 60s and 70s, but the parties were still crowded with, you know, attractive, good-looking, smart people, accomplished people. At least, you know, the kids in the Paris Review office downstairs were good-looking. Especially the young women who, unbeknownst to George, were having a contest to get his attention by seeing who could wear the shortest skirt. Big flirt, George. But George was also always looking for expeditions, like he had a scheme for Christmas in 1998. We would go green hunting elephants with his pal Ian Douglas Hamilton. This was to be an old-fashioned hunt, except with tranquilizer darts to tag the elephants for research. And Hunter would come too, of course, and we would all celebrate New Year's in Lamu. Well, we never made that trip, but we made many others involving Hunter, who, as I said earlier, shared this very unlikely but indelible friendship with George. I think they shared this even or because of or were connected in this way because they both felt, I am sure, more and more trapped by their very different personas that they had, in fact, evolved and developed themselves. But they had recognized each other as allies immediately, although they did not agree on what had happened when they first met, except that it was on the Lufthansa flight from Frankfurt to Zaire to cover the Ali Foreman fight, the so-called Rumble in the Jungle in 1974. George remembered that Hunter was worried about not getting paid for an appearance he had made at Duke University where he had run amok on wild turkey. Hunter said that he and George spent the flight comparing boxing notes like the professionals they were. George remembered Hunter talking about secret weapons, huge torpedoes being constructed by revolutionaries in the Congo to disrupt the fight. Hunter remembered George being greeted by the promoter Don King as a prince of the realm when they got off the plane in Kinshasa. And George would remember that while he embarked on a week of serious reporting, Hunter smoked hash in the hotel pool and wound up missing the fight. What I remember is that Muhammad Ali was very interested in both of them, how they worked. But back in the States, they talked about each other as if they were old friends, which was easy because they had so much in common. Their career-establishing books, Paper Lion for George and The Hells Angels for Hunter, were published within 2 months of each other over the 1966-67 cycle. Both were praised for the immersive reporting and original voice. So Hunter also loved what he called the wild power of the language and the purity of the madness that governs it and makes it music. George played the piano on short breaks when he was writing. Get up, play the piano for 5 minutes, go back and write more when he was stuck. They were both the same height, close to 6'4". They both loved drinking, they loved women and sports, and were evenly matched to a degree. George was a better athlete, Hunter was stronger, and they were both competitive. To that point, the competitiveness, in 1979, George and I decided to visit Hunter in Woody Creek, Colorado, after he had sent me a photograph of himself sinking a 30-foot putt at the Aspen Golf Club. He had signed it to me with Res Ipsa Loquitur across the image, and there was a message on the back. Come out and play golf with me sometime, and bring George and money. I will beat you both like mules. I had visited Owl Farm before and told George that there would be distractions, but we both arrived hopeful about our connected missions. My plan was to get Hunter to write a piece for a new magazine I was starting called Smart. George was there to interview him for the first of what he planned to be a series along the lines of Writers at Work, but this was going to be The Art of Journalism, Journalists at Work, for the Paris Review, and these interviews were already famous. Fine, Hunter said when we got there, but first we play golf. Well, acid golf, to be more specific. I'm just going to read a little bit here. We played that first evening in the dying light at the Municipal Aspen Golf Club, which was closed. Hunter waved to a guy in the pro shop who brought us a bucket of balls. Hunter had a 12-gauge shotgun in his golf bag, and we had Heinekens in a cooler on the cart. Also, a fifth of Chivas, a fifth of Jose Cuervo, limes, grapefruit, a fifth of Dewar's for George, and an extra cooler of ice. Then here, Hunter said, holding out 3 white tabs of blotter paper with an unfamiliar red symbol on them. Eat these. He put one on his tongue, like that, stuck it out at us, and I took my tab and did the same thing. When George said he wanted to concentrate on his golf, Hunter licked the 3rd tab. Ho ho, he said, last of the bunch, last of the batch. Well, as a side note here, I would tell you that George would try anything, but he was also so serious about the work that he wanted this interview to be very special, especially because of what we were obviously tripping into. And so George was working. Anyway, following Hunter's lead, we used the first tee as a driving range to warm up. His swing was explosive, if not smooth, and his 3rd drive was solid and long. George had a fluid swing and drove each of his balls successively further. I had never played golf, but I was not pathetic. Hunter accused me of sandbagging and said it was time to start the gambling. Get serious about the gambling. And we rode the cart to his favorite hole, the 14th, a short par 3, straight shot over a large pond. Now, the Aspen Golf Course is a certified Audubon sanctuary, and the pond was full of geese. Goddamn geese, said Hunter. Branta canadiensis, said George. You'd like George's bat trick, I said to Hunter. No bats, Hunter said. We're gambling. Alas, George said, and made himself a Dewar's in water. So each of us would have 5 balls in a row off the tee and then proceed to the green to putt. Only our best ball would count. And we were all in for $1,000, Hunter said. George put 5 of his balls on the green, all 5 of them, 3 close enough for makeable birdies. Hunter put 3 in the water and 2 on. I got none on, but did not care. When we got to the green, George put 2 of his balls in for birdies. Hunter had 1 ball left to tie if he could sink a 30-foot putt like the one he was celebrating in the photo he had sent. So he walked back and forth several times between the hole and the ball. I was on the other side of the cup holding the flag. It was dark, or as dark as it gets in Aspen in summer nights, which is not that dark. The sky still had that glow that it has out there. But I could barely see his ball. George was by the cart, making another Dewar's in water. The ice tinkled in the glass. Silence, Hunter shouted. I know your tricks. Hunter took at least 2 minutes lining up this putt. Then he struck it quickly. He missed the putt by about a foot. And charging after it, he let out a howl as he winged his putter into the pond. So the geese started honking, annoying to Hunter, who ran back to the cart, pulled the 12 gauge from his golf bag, and fired in the air over the geese. Not at the geese, in the air, over the geese, to excite the geese. And it occurred to me, as they lifted off the pond like a sparkling cloud of gray and silver feathers, that having a story to tell about playing acid golf with Hunter and George might actually be good for my career. but you'll be the judge of that. Anyway, we got to the interview the next afternoon, and it went on through the following night. Finally ending with George asking about writing under the influence of booze or drugs or whatever, noting to Hunter that every writer he'd interviewed over the years for the Paris Review had said they could not do it. It didn't work. They lie. is how Hunter began his answer, which ended with Hunter saying that, "Who the hell do you think wrote the book of Revelations? A bunch of stone sober clerics?" So that was it. When we were leaving the next afternoon, Hunter took me aside and whispered, "We have to get George better drugs." But the interview was great. And when it was about to appear, George sent Hunter an advance copy. Hunter sent back a page from the Bible, Revelations, with a big black spot on it. You'll recall, like the page Long John Silver sent to Billy Bones in Treasure Island to pronounce him guilty of stealing Captain Flint's treasure from the rest of the pirates. Note that. My problem was that launching Smart then, with less than $200,000, depended not just on this new desktop technology that I was fooling around with, but also on convincing writers to work for shares in the magazine. That is, more or less for free. Their names were the only real collateral I had for raising money, but everyone I asked signed up, starting with George. Now, Hunter loved the idea of having stock, only slightly less than he hated the idea of working for free. But he eventually agreed after George told him he thought it was a sound investment. He agreed to write a column called The Year of the Wolf, but no copy was forthcoming. George advised patience and encouragement. When I lost Smart to a Japanese investor and went to Esquire, Hunter's Year of the Wolf idea came with me. But it was still plagued by deadline misunderstandings, and he called often, always in the middle of the night, promising a draft of his secret novel instead. The secret novel was called Polo is My Life, and he said it had grown out of a piece that he had done on the Roxanne Pulitzer trial in Palm Beach, Florida, a couple of years before. This was the assignment that I had used to lure him back to Rolling Stone, and this is in the book. Jumping ahead. But anyway, George advised, again, still, patience and encouragement. Months passed, until as if by sympathetic magic, when I had decided to scrap The Year of the Wolf, Polo is My Life arrived at Esquire. But it was not a manuscript of the secret novel. Packed in a huge wooden crate tight with bubble wrap, Polo is My Life was a 4x8 plywood sheet with crossed polo mallets in the middle, crossed, and across the top, across the top he had spray painted the title Polo is My Life, and then hung 50 caliber rounds, corner to corner, and covered the rest of it with photos and press cards and bar napkins and x-rays and notes and quotes and lipstick and a joint or two, letters, court records. So the rest of the plywood was covered. It took 3 UPS guys to carry it into my office. So I mounted it on the wall in the conference room where it hung as a major attraction until I left the magazine. I would say it was Hunter's verdict of guilt on all editors, like that black spot he had sent to George. And George said he had never seen a writer put so much effort into not writing. So I puzzled over this, because Hunter had once told George that if he were rich, a relative term for Hunter, he'd wander around like King Farouk, which dates him, telling editors he was going to write something for them and then not doing it. George had shrugged when Hunter told him this and agreed that writing was hard. But of course, they both loved writing for that very reason, because it was hard and because they were good at it. Hunter always said that he had taught himself to write as a young man by reading The Great Gatsby as he typed it, read it aloud as he typed the entire manuscript. And his son Juan's middle name is Fitzgerald. Hunter's middle name is Stockton. He never explained it, only that his father had been born in the last century in a place called Horse Cave, Kentucky, a place name of great spookiness for Hunter. George's middle name, Ames, well, it's from his great-grandfather, Adelbert Ames, a Civil War hero. George had met the boy general when he was 6 and had thus looked into the eyes of a man who had faced Pickett's charge. Imagine what he saw, George would say. It was a story George told often. He loved to tell that story. He liked talking about his family. And as always, Hunter wanted to know more, especially about this boy general. Well, he was very severe and I was very afraid, George said. We were in the garden of his house and he picked up a twig, snapped it in half and said, "Life ends like that, boy." Hunter loved that. Most important magazines for George were the Paris Review, of course, and Sports Illustrated. From its first issue in 1954, SI kept careful records of freelance assignments, 4x5 index cards noting subject, deadline, fee, etc. One of the tallest stacks belonged to George, the first card from 1956, only 3 years after George began editing the Paris Review. The great literary quarterly he founded with Peter Matheson and several other friends. It was a hot startup before anyone used that term, and much has been written about the good times in Paris and the careers that came after. But the big question about George among his friends was why he spent so much time on the Paris Review instead of on his own writing. Some of his oldest friends at the Review, especially Matheson, Bill Styron, and Terry Southern, great writers all, were even a little arrogant about this. Why wasn't George tormenting himself with the ambition to write important books like they were, or something like that? Whenever this came up, George would get mad. If it went deeper to the enigma of why he was writing so much about sports, George would just turn silent. For George, the Paris Review became a spiritual hideout for 50 years. It paid nothing, of course, so George had decided to make his way as a journalist until he settled on what his more serious work might be. In the meantime, he would write about sports and have some fun at the same time. Now, there are a number of stories in the book that George did not write about his early days in participatory journalism at SI, like the first time out when he was pitching to the Major League All-Stars at Yankee Stadium when the public address announcer bungled his name, calling him George Proofrock. This was an irony not lost on George, a T.S. Eliot aficionado of sorts, who had lived for a time in the same tiny room used by the poet when he had attended Harvard. George did not write about this, as I said, but he used it in his storytelling with a reference to a famous line from the great love song of J. Alfred Prufrock. Well, he would say, my arm was rather like a ragged claw. You know your Prufrock. Well, anyway, when that story was expanded into George's first book, Out of My League, Ernest Hemingway wired from the Mayo Clinic, where he was being treated for depression, that it was, I'm quoting here, beautifully observed and incredibly conceived with the chilling quality of a true nightmare, the dark side of the moon of Walter Mitty. Now, it was a gift Hemingway intended as a marketing blurb, and Hemingway's Walter Mitty analogy has, I think, a surface truth to it. But it overlooks the obvious difference, that in Mitty's daydreams, he always succeeded, while George's real-life adventures, he always failed. The truth was that his work had more to do with everyman than Mitty. But it was always obscured, I think, by his careful, self-depreciating prose, which made him so easy and hilarious to read. Plus, Walter Mitty was a wimp, George Plimpton was not a wimp. Above George's desk in his apartment on 72nd Street, George had a photograph of Ernest Hemingway walking on a country road in Ketchum in winter, kicking a can. You've probably all seen this picture, kicking a can high over his head. This was just days before he killed himself in 1961. In my office, I had a photo of George wrestling the gun from the hand of Sirhan Sirhan moments after he had shot George's friend Bobby Kennedy in Los Angeles in '68. I was in George's office often, although he was never once in mine. This had nothing to do, I am sure, with the arrogance of never going to another man's office. It was just that George was too busy. Counter to his reputation for never missing a party, he guarded his calendar. And he spent most of his days under that photograph working, either writing or editing the Paris Review. And he was very, very hard about this, like he was hard about a lot of things. His writing, of course, and also the work of editors who edited him. George was irascible as both a writer and an editor, and a very tough edit on both sides of the desk. As an editor, he was unbending. But he also liked to warn fellow writers of the tin-eared butchery, he called it. They might suffer at the hands of magazine editors other than himself, for example. Even the best editors could be problematic, he would say. For example, none of his deep history with Sports Illustrated or his co-conspirator relationship with managing editor Mark Mulvoy, they had invented Sid Finch together, the April Fool's hoax, but none of that mattered when it came to the butchery again, done to his story on President George Herbert Walker Bush in 1988. The piece had started as an assignment to play horseshoes with the president-elect, but wound up edited into a survey of Bush family as athletes. George used to feign sleep when he explained that. Worse, according to George, cliches had been salted into it, and he saw none of the changes until he opened the magazine. Nothing worse than that. But George told me about this when we were working on a piece for Smart about what it was like to mouth catch a grape dropped from the top of the Trump Tower. Now, there's something about the seriousness we were applying to something so profoundly silly that made George even madder about the Bush piece and his betrayal by Sports Illustrated. But then, like everything with George, the disastrous story had a coda, perhaps apocryphal, but as far as I know, unchallenged. George was invited to pitch horseshoes again with Bush, this time at Camp David. And after the horseshoes, there was a game of tennis with the president, which was interrupted by the ringing of the ominous red phone. The president's face darkened as he crossed the court, but then brightened after he picked up the receiver. "It's for you," he said, handing it out to George. Whenever George told this story to reporters, and he did this often, they always asked, inevitably, who was calling. And he would lean close and whisper, "Mulvoy, Sports Illustrated wanting another story." We're not going to get that. So George didn't tell jokes, he told stories. And like his questions, his stories had a trampoline effect, bouncing you to the next story, with George making fun of himself usually along the way. He loved parody, especially self-parody. Even enthusiastically, you will recall perhaps appearing as a deranged version of himself on an episode of The Simpsons. When George was the host of Mousterpiece Theater, a parody of the PBS Masterpiece Theater, presenting cartoons instead of classic drama, he wrote and gave commentary, as well as background information before and after each episode. The shows had themes, like Goofy's character arc as an everyman character, and asked challenging questions. Is Donald Duck really a strident intellectual hero? Can he be a hero and an existentialist? The show ran late in the evening on the Disney Channel and was especially popular, we knew, among baby boom stoners. And President George Herbert Walker Bush was also said to enjoy the show. So George closed the 50th issue of the Paris Review 2 days before he died, and we spoke that afternoon about how he might contribute to Sports Illustrated upcoming 50th anniversary issue. As always, he had numerous ideas. He took me to dinner that night at the Brook Club, where we sat at a long communal table. George loved the Brook. He was a longtime member, spent a lot of nights there because it was a place where his celebrity never pestered him, left alone. Peter Matheson had mentioned to me that sometimes, if George thought he was unobserved, he would let his face go blank, and his jaw would drop open, and it made him look, to Peter anyway, like a dead man, or at least very sad, or fighting something very dark. Peter said it made him very sad whenever he saw George that way, but I had never seen it until that night. And when we were leaving, he told me that he had recently committed to a $750,000 contract to write that memoir, and he died the next night. A few days later, Sarah Dudley Plimpton was searching George's computer and came across a notes and obligations file. The last entry was written at 1:25 a.m. on September 25th, the morning he died in his sleep. George had returned home late, as always, and sat typing until he was tired enough to turn in. The memo was a run of reminders and ideas for future issues of the Paris Review, drafts of letters, anecdotes for that dreaded memoir. That last morning, George finished his notes with a poem by Emily Dickinson. Fame is a bee. It has a song. It has a sting. Ah, too, it has a wing. And the very last entry was a quote from André Gide. The drawback to a journey that has been too well planned is that it does not leave enough room for adventure. George was 76. Hunter said he never expected to live to 50, which was no consolation to any of us who knew him when he killed himself at age 67, a year and a half after George passed. And when I thought about Hunter's last moments, I wondered about his final plan, the secret he had kept as he loaded that .45. And I thought about the adventure of working with him and with George. When they were alive, it always surprised me how many people felt possessive about their friendships with George and with Hunter. And when they were both gone, I wondered about my own. I never told anyone, certainly neither of them, but in some kind of magical thinking, I thought of them as my best friends. Truer of my relationship with George, in spite of our age difference, Hunter was more like a crazy, dangerous uncle. But I was always aware of the gift George had to make people feel like they were great friends when they really weren't that close at all the great men. Hunter had that too, and he could put anyone at ease when he felt like it. And this happened more than his reputation suggests, and it always struck me as kind. Although his friendships could be situational or transactional, even, he was sentimental about all of them, I think. One Christmas he sent me an expensive pocket knife with "The Long Hunt" engraved on the blade. So George's bats in New Mexico and Hunter's midnight calls, they come back in flashes of memory. I think everyone who knew them has similar moments, remembering something one of them did or said that illuminates them. Every place I worked, George wrote at least one piece for me. I think Johnny Depp has Polo Is My Life Now, along with the rest of Hunter's papers. It was really an extraordinary piece. But then it was just another part of working with Hunter, like mouth-catching grapes was work with George. It was like that all the time. Outrageous when I think about it now. And maybe it didn't always make sense that the best work we did always had to have a joke at the bottom of it. Not ha-ha, but hilarious, like that black spot Hunter sent to George. And I remember that Treasure Island is a simple book with a clear plot. Adventurous boy kidnapped by pirates joins pirates. Thank you.
Are you happy to take some questions?
Oh, sure.
So we'd like to open it up now to some questions and answers, if anyone has any. I'll help facilitate that.
Terry, your book does a very amazing job of telling the stories and the experiences you've had, largely in the print media world. But towards the end, you were very involved in the development of the digital media business at Sports Illustrated. I've ridden the train for 25 years from here to New York. When I started, everyone was reading the New York Times. Now no one reads a paper. You know, I'm not asking you what's the future, because I think we all see the future. Does that make you sad?
Well, you know, full disclosure, we are former great colleagues. So maybe the way I'll answer that is by telling you all the joke that we had when we were at Time Inc. Change. What does it take to change a light bulb at Time Inc.? It takes 50. It takes 1 to screw in the new bulb, and it takes 49 to stand around and talk about how great the old light bulb was. That, I think the lack of innovation and vision on the part of these great old companies really has brought them down, or is bringing them down. And the more control leaves the hands of the people who actually create the product, or the product becomes devalued, the less likely they are to succeed.
You know, this is a bad paraphrase, but you said a well-planned adventure leaves no room for adventure, and I wondered who wrote that?
That was Gide, and I maybe misquoted it.
No, I misquoted you.
Oh, well, I don't know. Somebody called my attention to something similar, and I always check now. It's André Gide. The drawback to a journey that has been too well planned is that it does not leave enough room for adventure. André Gide. Sure.
Who is writing classics now, as was done maybe 100 years ago, whose books will be read as classics 100 years from now?
Whoa. I would plug all kinds of people who I write about in the book. I think that that are still writing. Richard Price, but my favorite writer still working is Joan Didion. I tried for years to get Joan to write for me at any one of these magazines, and although her husband John Gregory Dunn did, Joan never did. And I'll tell you, she is a woman of meticulous manners, but she is not a fan of ass kissing. But anyway, I think that there's a whole generation that is being canonized almost. There are people who are a little bit older than me who are still around, or they've just left. I think Jim Salter will be read for a long, long time. I think McGuane will reemerge as a very important voice. Couple notches down from that, like I said, I think that Richard Price not only sells many books and does wonderful television, but his novels about New York City will last. It's a long list for me. Over here?
Great.
Sure.
About technology, back to the gentleman. What would Hunter be saying today about blogs and Twitter, and what would you be saying to him about digital storytelling and collaboration, and then with that, the models like the Huffington Post, does that come into any of that thinking?
Well, I think that I've thought about this because Hunter would have been great as a blogger, because writers would question you as an editor or didn't really want to be edited. Hunter knew he needed an editor. And the way he would work is he would file false leads, very sharp, funny ironic, sometimes growling paragraphs, one after another, but they would not fit together. And so the job of editing him was to put, somehow, get those in an order so that they would make sense on, on the pages of Rolling Stone or wherever we were trying to do that with him. So, that's like a blog waiting to happen. And it could have been, immediate. And him, doing that on the campaign trail without the really 2.5, 3 week lag he had when he was covering Nixon. If he were covering Trump, we'd have some laughs. that would be good. And in the end, his last job was he wrote a weekly column for ESPN.com about gambling. He covered acid golf in there.
Has your son let you read his book? I know he's written several books. How do you feel about that?
Well, my son, Nick McDonell, wrote a book when he was young. He was 17. It was called 12, and it was a coming-of-age novel about the world that we live in here in New York City. And it was pretty harsh. And it was made into a really bad movie. But starring the people in The Gossip Girl and those people. But I was just always proud that he cared enough about the language to try to do that at that age. But he's written a couple more novels, but he has since become a correspondent. He's been in Iraq and Afghanistan, and he's interested in policy. He went to Oxford, and he's writing a book about civilian casualties as a result of American policy in those wars. So he's different, and I'm worried about him in a much different way now. He's in Kabul now. Thank you for asking that.
Any more questions?
It's been an honor. Thank you very much.